Afternoon, and welcome to Donald Trump, 4 More Years, a panel discussion on the 2020 U.S. elections sponsored by CIPS, the Center for International Policy Studies at the University of Ottawa. I'm Christopher Bishop, Counsel on Foreign Relations, International Affairs Fellow in Canada, and a Research Associate at CIPS. I'm also an American, and as an American who has spent most of my career living and working overseas, I've often been impressed and even humbled by how closely the rest of the world follows U.S. politics, and especially U.S. presidential elections. This is nowhere more true than in Canada, with whom the United States shares not only a common undefended border, but also common democratic values. And it's never been more true than now, when all parties agree we're facing a pivotal moment in American history. This afternoon, we're pleased to have 4 distinguished panelists from Canada and the United States to discuss the upcoming U.S. elections and what they might mean for Canada. Regina Bateson from the University of Ottawa, James McCormick from Iowa State University, David Shribman from McGill University and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Lester Spence from Johns Hopkins University. We've also invited each panelist to speak for approximately 5 minutes, and we'll then invite members of the audience to submit their questions through the chat feature at the bottom of their Zoom screens. If you would like to ask a question, please remember to include your name and affiliation. We'll proceed in alphabetical order, beginning with Regina Bateson, a political scientist at the University of Ottawa. Regina received her PhD from Yale University and previously served as assistant professor of political science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She has also served as a U.S. Foreign Service officer, and in 2018 was a Democratic candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives from California's 4th Congressional District. Her article on strategic discrimination in U.S. politics was just published last week by the American Political Science Association's journal, Perspectives on Politics. Dr. Bateson, welcome to the discussion.
All right, thank you, everyone. Would you like me to go ahead with my opening comments now, or did you want to introduce everyone?
No, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry for the confusion. All right, well, thanks so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure. So today I wanted to address what is different about this American election, this presidential election, than those that have come before it. And I think the obvious place to start would be polarization. That we are seeing a level of political polarization in the US that is quite unprecedented. The death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg last week has only exacerbated that. If there is one thing that binds Donald Trump to the Republican Party and traditional Republican voters, it is the Supreme Court and the judicial nomination process. And at the same time, the upcoming fight over the Supreme Court vacancy has energized Democrats who are vowing to do everything in their power to pull out all the stops to try to delay or disrupt this process. So I think that the looming fight over the Supreme Court is only going to exacerbate the already very high tensions existing around partisan politics in the United States. It's as though we had all the kindling there, all the firewood, and then someone has just poured gasoline on top and thrown a match into it. However, I actually don't think that's the most remarkable thing about this election. I think this election is truly unprecedented because of 2 aspects of it that transcend partisanship and partisan competition between Republicans and Democrats. The first is that equal rights are at stake in the United States. America has long been marred by systemic racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination. In particular, our police and law enforcement institutions have been far, far too slow to make meaningful change and to recognize that Black lives matter, including the lives of Black women like Breonna Taylor. But at the same time, you might be surprised to hear that among individual Americans, levels of sexism and racism are at historic lows, and Americans are increasingly aware of the reality and the problems of sexism, racism, and other forms of discrimination. In fact, polling from the Pew Research Center shows that the percentages of Americans who see racism as a major problem have grown markedly in recent years. So what we're seeing in this election is a conflict between a country that is increasingly diverse and increasingly tolerant, and a sitting president seeking re-election who does not appear to share those values or concerns. Finally, this election also transcends partisanship because it is fundamentally about democracy. To date, Donald Trump is different than all other prior GOP presidents or presidential nominees in that he persistently questions the integrity of the election in which he is currently competing. This is perhaps why he has come into such conflict with some members of his own party. In fact, some of the secretaries of state at the state level who have spoken out to defend their systems of mail-in voting have been Republicans. Yet Donald Trump's markedly anti-democratic language persists. And this may be why we've seen an unprecedented number of former Republicans, current Republicans, Republican campaign staff, even some former members of his administration speak out and shift to supporting Joe Biden. Just yesterday, Donald Trump said, when asked if he would commit to a peaceful transfer of power after the election, well, we're going to have to see what happens. We as political scientists often say that a country is a consolidated democracy when all the major players there agree on the rules of the game and abide by them. And to their credit, most leaders in the GOP do, but Donald Trump currently does not. And he is the one at the top of the ticket on the Republican side this fall. So what we're witnessing is not just an election, but an unprecedented challenge for American democracy. In just the past 24 hours, shots have been fired at a political gathering in Louisville, and vehicles have plowed into crowds of peaceful demonstrators in Denver and in Buffalo. Many Americans of all parties see a need for leaders who will calm tensions rather than inflaming them, and who will fight for democracy rather than undermining it. Just this week, in fact, Cindy McCain, the widow of former Republican presidential nominee John McCain, endorsed Joe Biden for president. In just a few weeks, we'll find out how many others agree with her, that they are Republicans, yes, but Americans first.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bateson. I'd now like to turn to James McCormick, Professor of Political Science at Iowa State University. In addition to serving as an American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow, he has also held numerous visiting positions in Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, and Canada, including Fulbright Canada Research Chair in Canada-US Relations at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, Carleton University. Professor McCormick, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to say what a great pleasure it is to be able to join this event from out here in the cornfields. And I'm particularly grateful to Jeffrey Simpson for initiating an invitation to me to participate here. As I said, for somebody out here in the cornfields and the sort of the flyover country, I thought I'd try to do a couple things today. I thought I'd first of all try to give you a sense of what the political lay of the land is in Iowa and sort of the Midwest. I'm a true Midwesterner, being born in Wisconsin and living most of my life here. And also I'd like to talk a little bit about foreign policy because that's my area of interest. And I want to suggest what might be the implications of a second term for President Trump or a first term for Vice President Biden in terms of American-Canadian relations. First of all, and sort of building on what was said just previously, the polarization is quite intense. Even in Iowa, even in the Midwest, even in an area that has traditionally been, if you will, more conservative, more Republican-oriented. I wanted to share with you that there just was an Iowa poll released just a couple days ago by the Des Moines Register, and remarkably, it said it found that Iowans supported Trump at 47% level, and they supported Biden at 47% level. And the pollster, Ann Selzer, who's long been involved in polling in Iowa and beyond, said that she had never seen such a tightly knit kind of poll result here. Only 7% of the Iowans were did not have an opinion, were unsure of who would they would support. The other thing that's remarkable about this is that 83% of the respondents said that they were fully committed to their positions. So this kind of division is quite profound here. Not only is there sharp differences on the political level, but there's also sharp differences on gender level. Men support President Trump by about a 20% margin over women, and women support Biden by about a 20% margin. Again, these are some of the highest figures that we have seen. I mean, I think in recent elections, the highest figure ever in terms of the so-called gender gap has been about 11%. So this is a really yet further indication of how deeply divided the American electorate is, and even sort of the Midwestern electorate is. There's also sharp divisions, and this is not so surprising, on rural-urban divide here. But interestingly, the factors that motivate these voters, the divisions that they have, are also sharply divided on issues. For example, Republican supporters by this poll support President Trump based largely on the economy and based on law and order issues. Those are the two highest, most important issues that they identify. Whereas Democrats identify the pandemic and healthcare as crucial to their decision choice here. And this kind of divide, we have a very contested Senate race in Iowa as well, with Senator Joni Ernst and her challenger, Teresa Greenfield, and they're locked in the same kind of divide. I'm not going to go through, I've rehearsed enough numbers for you, but they're divided in the same kind of way, with the margin between them, with Greenfield ahead by about 3 percentage points, which is obviously within the margin of error here. Now these results, I think, obviously I don't have the data to demonstrate this forthrightly, but it seems to me that these results are really indicative of the Midwest more generally. And I thought it would be important for a Canadian audience to be aware of that. Both Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan, if you look at sort of the 2016 electoral map, it's really this kind of rural-urban divide, and all of the polls, although Biden is leading in those states by a margin in every one, although oftentimes within the margin of error, if you will. I think this reflects the kind of divisions that the Midwest is having, and really says something about how polarized and how divided and how contentious, frankly, this election is and likely will be. One other factor that I wanted to mention, which really stunned me when I saw the data on this, is that the expected spending in Iowa on the presidential campaign is $150 million. You've got to realize that there are 3 million people in the state of Iowa, about 2 million registered voters in the state of Iowa, and $150 million. So you cannot watch television, or maybe it's also can't look for the news online without having an ad pushed in your face here. The advantage here actually is for the Democrats. They're spending about $90 million, and the Republicans about $64 million. So it's a little bit over 150 if you're following my math here. The other area I want to talk about is, I was looking at some of the Canadian polls on this. Their view of President Trump is about a 20% of favorability rating, and the favorability rating of the United States has gone down to about 35%. These are markedly low levels for American officials here. Usually, along with the UK, Canada is right up there in terms of the favorability ratings. And so this is really a drop-off. And so I'm sure that some in the audience are wondering, how can President Trump be consistently so popular, at least seemingly so, in the Midwest, with such low favorability ratings, not only in Canada, but around the world, and even at home as well. And I've just identified 5 or 6 factors that I think fit into this and why there's appeal in the Midwest. First of all, as many of you might know or may not know, there's a considerable Republican tradition within the Midwest. Certainly this has changed over time. Even in Iowa became for a time a very competitive state. And at the present time, for example, we have 3 Democratic House members from the state here. But there is that strong Republican tradition that has stayed there. We had a governor that served for, I don't know how many years. Christopher, remember how many governors?
16.
How many years he served.
16.
But I think, the longest serving Republican governor in the country, actually. But also in the Midwest, there's a limited government kind of sense, an individual responsibility notion that pervades kind of the political culture here. There's an economic interest in having more free trade, although that has been a hiccup a little bit with the Trump administration, as you might follow. But they're also very keen and sort of as their responses to some of the polling that the president has tried to make these kind of trade deals around the world here. I think also the Midwest generally is more socially and culturally conservative than the coast. And this has played out even as some of our, and a lot of rural traditions, even as some of the small towns in Iowa are very much dying. And I guess the final point I would make in terms of the relative appeal is that Trump's nationalist appeal does not go unheard in the Midwest. This idea of America first is not something that is sort of kicked under the rug here or put to the side. Having said all that, what impact will a Trump re-election or a Biden election have on Canadian American relations? I'm not going to go through all of these things, but I think on a substantive level, there will be some friction in the relationship. There always has been, but these are largely manageable. Whether it's over the Keystone XL pipeline, which there's obviously a difference between Trump and Biden on, this whole question of extradition of Meng and so on, the border issue, which I think actually have been quite cooperative on, how the USMCA will be implemented. There's always softwood lumber hearkening in the background as an issue. Defense spending in NATO, maybe the Arctic. These are kind of back burner kind of issues, but might be brought up. I think the real difference is, and I think probably the audience has anticipated this, is really on the sort of the soft power side in between Biden and Trump. I mean, Trump, America's first style, his unilateralism, his bilateralism really doesn't ring true at all with the Canadian commitment to multilateralism, to commitment to the involvement in the international system on a collective kind of basis here. Trump's unpredictability, his use of tweets, his broadsides against leaders, whether it's Prime Minister Trudeau or others, obviously does not get any kind of great receptivity. So these stylistic factors with the Trump re-election will continue to foster, it seems to me, low favorability ratings and probably dampen some of the efforts to resolve some of these fissures that sometimes occur in the relationship between the US and Canada. On the other hand, Vice President Biden's style is markedly different, I think more attractive, more predictable in some of his stances, less confrontational, more committed to alliance policy and multilateralism. And one of his major statements on what he would do in his presidency has called for a summit of democracies within his first year to reassert democratic values and includes not only governments, but civil society groups. He has made that call. And I think that is very attractive. I don't think you'll see any invocation of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act, the national security provision of that act, in terms of imposing tariffs. There will be no surprises, no aluminum tariffs for a month or two. So I think there really would be more attention. There probably will be a rapid filling of the ambassadorship that has sometimes been an issue in Canadian-American relations. In general, and to quote, I guess it was George Shultz who originally said it, there will be more tending of the garden with the diplomatic relationship between Canada and the United States with the Biden administration. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCormick. Our next panelist is David Shribman, currently the J.W. McConnell Professor of Practice at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University. Mr. Shribman served as executive editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette from 2003 to 2019, and has also worked at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Boston Globe, where he received the 1995 Pulitzer Prize for beat reporting. He also contributes a regular column on American politics for the Globe and Mail. Mr. Shribman, over to you.
Well, thanks very much. I hope you all can hear me. You'll let me know if you can't. I'm the product of a Massachusetts father and a Montreal mother, so I am the personification of American-Canadian relationships and relations, I'm happy to say. And from my earliest days, growing up in Massachusetts, I had a great affinity and love for Canada, which I transferred into an application for dual citizenship, which I now enjoy quite proudly. So I'm a citizen of both nations. In all of that time, I've watched very carefully from my newspaper purchase and elsewhere, the nature of this relationship. It's never really been quite as poor as it is today. We all know a lot of these stories about what's happened over the years when, for example, Lester Pearson, who gave a blistering speech about the Vietnam War in Philadelphia, then went down to Camp David to see Lyndon Johnson. President Johnson did not greet him warmly. In fact, he grabbed him by the neck at Camp David and shook him viciously. That was actually an assault also on the dignity of a Nobel Prize winner, of course, and an assault on American-Canadian relations. In 1937, I think it was 1938, President Roosevelt traveled to Canada to dedicate a bridge with Mackenzie King, and he extended the American military umbrella to Canada, where it remains today. It was a fabulous moment. I've read all of the clippings from all of the newspapers and read all the speeches. And it warms the hearts of both Americans and Canadians to understand and to see vividly the extent to which the Americans and Canadians were together in 1938, a year before Canada entered World War II and 3 years before the United States did so. There obviously have been ups and downs in the relationship over time, particularly during the Taft administration in the U.S. The consistent and persistent worry that the United States was about to invade and take over Canada. Of course, the Canadian or British invasion of the United States in the War of 1812 that led to the burning of the White House and actually the naming of the White House when it was repainted. So there have been ups and downs, but never quite as dramatic as this. The relationship between the Prime Minister and the President is frosty at best. It's not even correct. It's a horrifyingly bad relationship. Both men loathe each other. President Trump regards Prime Minister Trudeau as a callow youth, and Prime Minister Trudeau regards the President as a callous dictator. I don't think that that's too strong a way to put his view of the President, and it's caused a lot of tension. It's caused a lot of families that have been separated because the border's closed. The border's closed, of course, because of COVID, not necessarily because of the relationship between the two men or between the two countries. I spent last year teaching at McGill, and will return in January with any luck. And I was telling the panelists beforehand that I went there with the devout hope and belief that I'd be able to escape talking about Donald Trump over every meal, every drink, every dessert, every moment on the subway, every moment in the market. And yet I found myself assaulted as an American by Canadians who wanted to know how it could be that President Trump could be elected, what he was like, what could happen, what the election will be like. It's a preoccupation in Canada as much as it is in the United States. It led me to conclude, by the way, that President Trump, whether he's reelected or not, actually has succeeded in fulfilling his fondest wish. He's always wanted to be the most important person on earth, and he is, in fact, now the most important person on earth. He's the beginning of every conversation and the end of every conversation. I think it was of Teddy Roosevelt that it was said that he wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. I think that can be said as well for President Trump. What's ahead? Nobody really knows what's ahead. The other panelists have spoken eloquently and accurately about the polls, about the notion, about the threat on the transfer of power peacefully if the president were to lose and still claim that he had won. There have been some developments in recent weeks, in recent minutes, in which from some of the most unlikely sources, including Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, saying that there will, in fact, no matter what happens, be an orderly transfer of power. We can only hope that's the case. We've had, I think, 5 episodes in American history where the winner of the Electoral College was not the winner of the popular vote. We had one horrifying example in the 19th century when Governor Tilden of New York ran against Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. It was a case where the winner of the Electoral College and the winner of the apparent winner of the popular vote were different. It was settled in the worst possible way in I believe it was a committee of 15 people that was supposed to be 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats, but in fact it was 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats who inevitably ruled that the president in 1877 would be Rutherford B. Hayes. It was a very messy process, so messy that in many communities where there are streets that are named for all the presidents, it goes Lincoln, Johnson, Grant, etc. There was actually a Tilden Street. There's a Tilden Street in Washington, D.C., by the way. I lived a block away from there. It's at the corner of 48th and Tilden. Is a yellow home that, had I been a young boy with a paper route where I lived, I would have been on my paper route. And it was the place where Richard Nixon actually, and Pat Nixon and their 2 children, Tricia and Julie, lived. They actually lived on Tilden Street, a street named for a president who wasn't really a president. We hope we won't have a situation like this. Any account of that episode in 1877 reads brutally in the year 2020, and we don't want our grandchildren to have to read that about our own elections. So as we go forward, we're testing the American system, we're testing the Electoral College, we're testing our forbearance, and we're testing, I think, the most important element, so far unnamed in this seminar, and that is what I think the entire election comes down to. It doesn't come down to the Supreme Court. It doesn't come down to cages on the border. It doesn't come down to taxes. It doesn't come down to regulation. It comes down, in my mind, simply to fatigue. Is the country too tired to permit another 4 years of Donald Trump? Does it want a Biden respite? If it's not too tired and wants more of this, Donald Trump may have 4 more years. I think it's just as likely it's tired of this and that Vice President Joe Biden will have his chance. So I think it's the fatigue factor, and I hope in this hour and a half our viewers aren't fatigued by this conversation, but I suspect by November 3rd they'll be sick to death of the whole thing. And it won't even end then. So that's my talk.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shribman.
Thank you.
Our final panelist is Lester Spence, Professor of Political Science and Africana at the Johns Hopkins University and an award-winning teacher, writer, and scholar. His current research focuses on the AIDS crisis in Black communities and on the growing role of the police in American cities. Please welcome Professor Lester Spence.
Thank you for having me. It's funny because when Mr. Shribman talked about being basically the product of a Canadian and an American coupling, it reminded me of a friend of mine, a political scientist, Frank Baumgartner. Frank Baumgartner is white, but he's from Detroit, as I am. And my Black parents are both from Detroit. There's one's from the east side and one's from the west side, right? So when I was telling this to Frank Baumgartner, Frank was like, wow, that must have been tough. You had a mixed marriage. And I never thought about myself as being the product of a mixed marriage until He told me that. So it's good to be on a panel with somebody else who's also the product of a mixed marriage. What I want to do is gently push at some of the dynamics brought up by other panelists and focus on race. I'm gonna simplify it significantly because I'm gonna try and really talk within my 5 to 7 minute window so we can have a broader conversation. So one of the other things Mr. Shribman talked about was that Hayes-Tilden compromise. That Hayes-Tilden compromise is important in the American context for one other reason. The Hayes-Tilden compromise ended up being the death of Reconstruction. After the Civil War, what ended up happening is blacks were given the right to vote. And what they did was they used that right to vote to promote an aggressively different and more progressive model of democracy and stole power in many ways from the Southern planter regime that had dominated the region. As a result of the Hayes-Tilden compromise, that dynamic was rejected and then gradually replaced with a Jim Crow regime. And I think that one of the dynamics there are two dynamics where on one level, we're kind of not talking about academically, but we're talking about in the streets. One of those dynamics is the racial dynamic. And then the other dynamic is kind of the non-horse race dynamic. I'm gonna talk about that in a second. So Mr. McCormick talked about Midwestern attitudes and how people in places like Iowa were dealing with Trump, as opposed to the coast, as opposed to the East Coast, the United States where I live, and the West Coast, right? What I'm gonna do is share my screen for just a few minutes and show you a few pictures, right? How do you do this? Yeah, one, share. So what you're looking at now are the results of the 2016 election. This is what I call the Red Nation. The Red Nation reflects the vote that Donald Trump received in the 2016 election. And what you see is that if we actually made this kind of its own nation, it would be contiguous with the exception of the area closest to I guess Montreal, like this northeastern wing. Everything else, you can basically get in a car and drive from here all the way to here pretty much without having to quote unquote travel on land, right? So keep that image in your head, stop sharing. And then what I'm gonna do is see if I can find this other image. There we go. What we're looking at now is the vote that Hillary Clinton received in 2016. And what you find is that this area is actually not contiguous at all. So if everything else was water, you pretty much have to end up having a boat in order to transverse these different spaces. Now, one argument is that when we talk about Trump, what we're kind of neglecting is, when we talk about Trump, what we're kind of neglecting is that these different dynamics, this red nation and this blue archipelago, they have a long, long history in the States. And even if we think about it, if we just think about Trump, Trump isn't necessarily, Trump is exacerbating differences, but Trump actually isn't causing these differences. These differences have endured. Dr. Bateson is absolutely right about, in one way, the reduction of racist attitudes and sexist attitudes in the American population. But in another way, I complicate it, because what the research shows is that, in part as a result of the Trump election, we've actually seen a significant increase in the willingness to express old school racist and sexist attitudes. Now, how do we map this onto the election results that I just saw, that I just showed you? And as a result, and as an aside, I just know that although Mr. McCormick is absolutely right about the Midwest dynamic, you know, this is the Midwest. So Milwaukee is in the Midwest, Detroit's in the Midwest, Chicago's in the Midwest, Iowa City's in the Midwest. So I complicate that just that way. But if you think about how these attitudes map onto space, what we find is that red nation is the nation in which attitudes about race are most virulent. And also that red nation is the area in which has the least dense population and is the widest, right? However, it is also the area, I'm gonna share one more screen, and then after that, try to segue out. Where are you? I'm gonna have to share. This will be kind of messy. I'm going to share. So I want you to look in the middle. I've got a lot of stuff going on, but I want you to look at this graph. It's the significant increase. It posits a significant increase in inequality over time, with really, really high levels in during the Great Depression, and really, really high levels now, and really low levels in between. I'd actually argue that if we looked at it spatially, this inequality, these high levels of inequality, the costs are borne primarily by two populations. One is the predominantly Black and brown poor people in the metropolitan areas that tended to vote for Clinton, but the other is in those rural areas that tend to vote for Donald Trump. So what we're looking at with this election is the kind of sort of I began talking about the Cold War. What we're looking at to a certain extent with this election is kind of, or the Civil War, is the extension of kind of or the crystallization of a cold civil war between two very different bodies of folk that are spatially dispersed, even as a significant chunk of them actually express or are dealing with the same economic issues. The final thing I'd mention is there's that second thing, right? So if you look to the streets, we see this dynamic playing out with Black and brown and white protesters arguing for justice for people like Breonna Taylor, and whites, oftentimes rural whites, moving to state centers like Lansing in the state of Michigan, arguing for anti-mask policies. But the other thing to talk about is, as the biggest concern about the election is not necessarily whether who wins and loses vote-wise, is really, and it is whether he leaves, but it's also to the extent to which Trump has in place a tendency embedded in the bureaucracy that is actually pretty committed to making sure that he wins, although albeit illegitimately. And then the question in that case would be, what type of force that American citizens and maybe the world citizens will be able to muster in response to that. So on that note, I'll shut up and wait for the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Spence. We'll now start to take questions from the audience. We have a few that have come in already, but I'd invite you to ask a question by going to I think it's actually the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please include your name and your affiliation with your question. I'm going to exercise the moderator's prerogative and answer the first question myself, and I'll ask the first question myself, and I'll throw this open to all of the panelists. Several of you have brought up the president's statement yesterday declining to commit to a peaceful transfer of power. My question is this just sort of Trumpian bluster that's designed to appeal to the president's base, or is this a real threat to American democracy? And particularly for the Canadian audience, and even for Americans, can you explain what would happen if there was a disputed election? What's the actual process that we're looking at? And I'll, again, Professor Spence, if you would like to start, or anyone else, please go ahead.
Well, I can start. I mean, first of all, we saw in 2000 and again in 1876 that they can this process can take any number of paths depending upon the circumstances. It can go to the courts, it can go to a commission, it can go to the House of Representatives, where each state has one vote, and don't think that because the Democrats control the House that Biden would win, because there are more states with House Representatives members, majorities who are Republican, that are Republican than there are Democratic. It could be something that will be litigated in the courts. It could be litigated at the state level and then at the national level. There's no real, there's no precedent, and there's no real handbook for how this happens. It depends on many of the circumstances that could arise. So it could be chaos. And when Shakespeare said the first thing we do is kill all the lawyers, the American people will have that impulse, I think, on the 4th or 5th of November if this goes into overtime. We went into 36 days of overtime in the year 2000. Johnny Apple, R.W. Apple, the New York Times, after day 6 or 7, wrote a page 1 commentary that said 2 more days and that's enough, as if the press and R.W. Apple of the New York Times could control this. It's basically spun out of control, which it could do this time. I think our fondest hope would be that somebody wins a landslide and that we don't have to go through all this.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to jump in on that question? Go ahead, Regina.
Well, I'll just jump in, not so much on the procedural side, but rather on the comment from Trump yesterday. And to me, I think the important thing is that that we view that comment in context. So it's not as though Trump has been, displaying total confidence in the process of voting and the upcoming election this entire time. And this was one offhand comment that he made on a bad day. No, this is an intentional strategy. And it is, in fact, one of the most consistent messages in his campaign is to question the legitimacy of the election. You also see policy decisions being made at the federal level and to some extent throughout the country to make it difficult for people to vote. We saw some alarming things happening with the Postal Service recently federally that could make it difficult for people to get their mail-in ballots in on time. So I think that there are currently very serious threats to the electoral process itself, and the language itself that Trump is using undermines confidence in the election and in the democracy. So I don't think it's realistic to say that Trump is not going to go peacefully if he loses, particularly given statements that have come out from members of his own party, given the way that he is checked and constrained by the courts. In fact, also given the sort of values and democratic tradition of the military in the US, I don't think you're going to see Trump staying if he loses. But I do think that the assault on the process that he's unleashed is quite damaging, and it will be very difficult to repair in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Bateson. Dr. McCormick, Dr. Spence, would you like to add anything on that? No? Okay. Let's move on to the first question from the audience. This is from Dr. Sam Vaez. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It says, those fearful about Trump's presidency for 4 more years point to statements which appear to continue rejecting the promises on which U.S. democracy is based, and also the notion of a rules-based international order. Should this happen in 2020, do you think that the U.S. could do it all again in 4 years' time should someone Trumpier than Trump decide to run in 2024? I'll open that to everyone on the panel. Anyone? Prospects for, again, as I take the question, in 2024, if President Trump serves a second term, I think that the implicit question is, what is the political landscape going to look like post-Trump in 2024?
I'll jump. Well,
Go ahead, Professor McCormick.
Yeah.
Well, I'll jump in on that. As I read the question, I was trying to decipher the question a little bit. It seems to me that what he's saying is that if there's a continuous rejection of the international order and sort of the basic elements of democracy, will that become a model for the future? That's the way I took the question. Maybe I've interpreted it incorrectly. I don't think so. I think that I continue to believe that American political system is pretty strong, and there's a commitment to constitutional principles. And, you know, it may well be, and I think it's probably the case, that you know, Trump is an aberration here. I think that, you know, getting through this election, getting through whatever transfer of power takes place is really the critical factor. I just don't think it'll be the model for subsequent politicians here. Or maybe I'm just being, maybe it's a normative position that I'm taking here. It surely is, that I hope it will not be sort of the model for the future. But I may have misinterpreted the question. I'm sorry.
No, Mr. McCormick, I think you get the question right. The challenge in answering that, though, is that we're answering the question in the middle of a pandemic. So we've had 200,000 people die already. That's half the number of people the United States lost in World War II. And Trump has expressed a significant disdain for science and the scientific method. So if he gets another 4 years, we're not necessarily looking at a linear dynamic, right? We're looking at if these things, if he gets elected and they're not able to get a hold of the virus, what we're looking at is the significant destabilization of a range of other American institutions. So under those contexts, under that type of context, it's difficult to see how a range of institutions being resilient enough to basically withstand a Trumpian assault. And then secondarily, the other part of the question is somebody who's Trumpier than Trump. The biggest concern I would have is that somebody actually does Trump right. And by that, I mean that Trump he doesn't have a significant attention span. He's actually not that, he's pretty ignorant. He's not really interested in learning. If you actually have a political candidate who has Trump's political project without Trump's personal flaws, then you're looking at something. I have a pretty big imagination, but you're looking at something I read comic books a lot, and comic books deal with extinction level events all the time. That's what comic books kind of do. We'd be looking at kind of an extinction level event.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to jump in on this question? All right, let's move on to the next question from Lawrence Cumming. I would appreciate the thoughts of the panelists on why there appears to be such a profound lack of interest in pursuing a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College system, which twice within a period of 16 years produced presidential winners with substantially fewer popular votes than the winners received. I'll open this to anyone. I would say, particularly for some members of the audience who may not be familiar, so I think a lot of Americans probably don't really understand how the Electoral College works. If someone would like to give a 30-second introduction to the Electoral College, why it exists, and then go on to answering the question on why perhaps it should be abolished.
Okay, I'll try that. So the Electoral College grew out of the Constitution, obviously, and it grew out of one of the animating notions of the Constitution is that the United States was a union not so much of people but of states, and that states ought to have power. Every state has the number of congressional members as their Electoral College value. In other words, it's 2 because everybody has 2 senators plus a number of House members. So a state like Vermont, which has 1 House member, would have 3 electoral votes. I was in Maine this morning that has 2 members of Congress of the House and 2 senators. It has 4 electoral votes. The notion has been that in all of the elections except for 5, generally speaking, the winner of the popular vote wins the Electoral College. And in fact, scientifically, if you have a majority of about 2.5%, you do win the Electoral College pretty much every time. One of the reasons I've been thinking about Maine recently is that it's one of 2 states, along with Nebraska, that awards its electoral votes not as a winner-take-all notion. In other words, if you win California, you get 57 electoral votes. It doesn't work that way in Maine or in Nebraska. In each of those 2 states, you get 2 electoral votes if you win if you win a plurality, and then you get 1 electoral vote for each congressional district in which you prevail. In Maine, last time around, the first congressional district, which is around Portland in the southern part of the state, voted for Hillary Rodham Clinton, as did the rest of the state. So she got 3 electoral votes. But the northernmost congressional district, which abuts on Canada, Quebec and New Brunswick, gave a plurality to Trump, and he got 1 electoral vote. I began this week to examine the reason for that, and it was because Maine decided after the 1968 election that this electoral college thing was a real disaster. And so it, as a reform movement by both Republicans and Democrats, decided to go to this scheme as a way to maybe to prompt the rest of the country to pay attention. Well, it being Maine, no one paid much attention to it, and it only came into effect once. But generally speaking, the Electoral College is designed in modern times to make sure that the campaign isn't only conducted in California, New York, Florida, Ohio, and a couple of other states. There would be no campaign events anywhere else if it were a popular vote. There are plenty of arguments for that and plenty of arguments against it. So my fellow colleagues on this panel might be able to argue one way or the other, but generally speaking, the money and the votes are in California, New York, and Florida, and that's where the campaign would be without any electoral college. Our friend Mr. McCormick in Iowa would hardly see any candidate, although he sees them all in February when it's too cold to do anything else. So I'll let the rest of the panelists tell me why I'm wrong or go on one side or the other. But I think generally speaking, it's a reflection of American federalism that grows out of the compromises of the 1787 and the creation of the Constitution. So that's actually a non-academic's view.
Would anyone else like to jump in on that?
A very thorough view. Thank you. He's right. Somebody from Iowa is probably not going to be very favorable to the elimination of the Electoral College because it would mean, as he correctly pointed out, that the election would be decided in a relatively few states, and many of the Midwest states would be on outside looking in.
Can I just press on that, though, because I'm thinking of Dr. Bateson, who has experience in California politics. California is the most populous state in the union. It's slightly bigger than Canada in population. It has 55 electoral votes, but it has gone reliably Democratic, I think, since 1988. And as a result, it's not in play in an election because everybody just assumes it's going to vote for a Democratic candidate. How is the Electoral College seen in a big state like California, or for that matter, even in New York, which is sort of a similar situation?
Well, I think certainly in California, there is occasionally some frustration from voters or some feeling that it would be nice to move to a state where your vote counted in a general election for president a bit more than it does in California. But, at the same time, California plays a large role in primaries, at least on the Democratic side, and is a hub for fundraising. So candidates do come through and people are engaged. There are competitive races at the more local level and for congressional seats in California because, as we saw in the maps that were put up earlier, California is not at the local level. It is not a solid block of blue. There are areas that are more red and more purple. So, I think the reality, though, I think that people are quite pragmatic that, we're talking about a country where, the two parties simply cannot get anything done. And there is, again, an extremely high level of polarization. So just realistically, if you're talking about attempting to push for something like reforming or abolishing the Electoral College, I think the likelihood of moving forward with that right now is incredibly slim. And there are so many other threats to rights, to economic well-being, and to people's basic health and safety that I think, many kind of activists and people active in politics there would prioritize those at a higher level.
Now, if I could add something else, California went for the Republican candidate in 1976, 1980, and 1984. California has spawned 2 Republican presidents. It may not be competitive today, but it could be competitive some other year. And so for many, many years, the entire state was run by Senator Noland of California, a Republican who had basically a machine. So this state goes back and forth. In 1934, there was that wonderful election that involved Upton Sinclair. He lost, of course, but California can be competitive in another era. It might be 4 years from now. It's unlikely, but maybe 8 years from now. So California isn't always going to be Democratic.
So I make just 2 comments. One comment is that there's still the same structural flaws exist for the Electoral College. So if you follow the American media, every 4 years, there are only a small number of states that they focus on poll-wise when it comes to the election. They focus on Florida, they focus on Michigan, they focus on Pennsylvania, every now and then they focus on Wisconsin. The last time somebody talked about one of the Dakotas, I probably wasn't alive. The last time somebody talked about Wyoming, I probably wasn't alive. The last time they probably visited Wyoming, I might not have been alive. So there's still that. Secondly, although Dr. Bateson is absolutely right about the hurdles involved in trying to reform Electoral College, there's actually another dynamic in that the Republican Party, I think, has been, over the course of the past few decades, has been fairly good at using the idea of state change to mobilize voters, right? So if, for example, if you think about Roe versus Wade, Roe versus Wade is a Supreme Court ruling that basically made abortion legal in the United States. The Republican Party has, for the most part, been mobilizing people to the poll implicitly and explicitly with the idea of reversing that. That's why the Supreme Court is so important. And on the other hand, we just haven't seen the Democratic Party actually mobilize based on reform principles, whether it's radical reforms like perhaps adding the number of court reform, adding a number of Supreme Court justices to the Supreme Court, or removing the Electoral College, or it's even kind of minor reforms, like making sure everybody can vote, like making voting a holiday or something like that. They're willing to run on making government function, but they're not willing to run on reform. Now, part of that is because it is hard, but the other part of it is, and I might get some pushback, is the Democratic Party isn't all that democratic.
I just want to correct one thing I said earlier, and that there were 3 Republican candidates, Republican presidents from California. I forgot to mention Herbert Hoover. But generally speaking, I agree with Professor Spence on the structural deficiencies of this whole system. But I would add that in some years, for example, Georgia this year, North Carolina this year, are in play, certainly during the 1968 election with 3 candidates, one of whom was a blatant racist, another one who appealed to race. All of the 11 states of the old Confederacy were basically in play. So Reagan did well in the South by a very, very quiet racial appeal, or lack of appeal from my point of view. But generally speaking, I would agree with Professor Spence, but I did want to make the correction on the 3 presidents.
I would just disagree a little bit that Herbert Hoover was born in Iowa, actually.
Oh, he was born in West Branch, but he didn't hang around there very long. and West Branch is hardly part of America, for Christ's sake. It's wonderful. I've been there.
Yes.
Another example of polarization in American politics. All right, our next question is going to come from Natasha Lopez. She's a second-year MA student at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at uOttawa. Her question has to do with the resilience of U.S. institutions. How are government institutions handling the constant changes with the Trump administration? And if Biden does win, how do you think he will go about reconstructing these different institutions? Who would like to take a crack at that? Go ahead, Dr. Bateson.
Yeah, well, I'll just start us off by saying that, the Trump administration really has eviscerated some of the core institutions of the federal level of government in the United States. So I think everyone has been shocked by the performance of the CDC and the politicization of the CDC, most recently during the pandemic. Our moderator today is probably not allowed to say this because he's currently still with the Foreign Service and the State Department. But, if you go look into the upper echelons of the State Department, a lot of key positions are vacant. A lot of really skilled long-term career diplomats have left as a result of Trump's leadership and his appointees' leadership. That's replicated across other federal agencies. So I think that just on a very practical level, looking at the workings of American government and the presence of, skilled people with the public policy expertise that we need, a lot of them aren't there anymore. Maybe they can be lured back as political appointees or lured back to some of their former positions should Biden win. I hope that kind of structural rebuilding and reinvestment in the federal public service will happen. But I think that should Trump be reelected, I think there will be very serious damage in the long term to some of those federal institutions that, again, people around the world used to look at as models of expertise and leadership, and we can't really do the same anymore.
Anyone else like to have a say on that one?
Well, one of the areas, that has expanded has been President use of executive orders and so on to govern. And that, Trump gets a lot of pushback on that for doing that, and certainly he has added to that, but it actually started a couple presidents ago. So this has not been, a problem that just is a fundamental problem over the last several years. Presidential power has been expanding, and the use and presidents have increasingly used their authority. Partly, they say, of course, because of Congress and its stalemated situation, but nonetheless, that's been a problem. It seems to me that presidential power has been so expanded here that we sometimes refer to the American system as the presidential system. Although Article 1 of the Constitution, of course, is the Congress, and that was the first article that the founders really put into place. So there really has to be a need, an effort to really rein in the executive branch. It seems to me in the use of some of these powers here, and let the Congress decide.
I think
I was hoping I'd get pushback on that.
So one of the interesting, the second part of that question, though, I think was is something to consider. Like, what if Biden's elected? How do you reconstruct it? So one thing that Biden's going to have to do, because it's not just simply a matter of repopulating. It's not just simply a matter of opening up the jobs. What they're going to have to do, because the corruption has been so virulent, is basically open up space for people to actually talk about all the corruption that's existed. So what we might need is something, a different issue and a different scale, but we might need something like a Truth and Reconciliation Project, just so we can understand how corrupt these institutions have become in order to have a better sense of what types of structural changes we need to make going forward, in addition to hiring new folk.
Okay. Regina,
I'll jump in quickly. I just wanted to agree and to say that, the 9/11 Commission report is an interesting model. I'm not sure that we could really see that level of bipartisan cooperation now. I wish that we could. But I think, that was a moment where people agreed that there had been clear failures at the federal level and clear failures in government. And there was a real commitment made to have a serious inquiry and see where the facts led, and then to issue a public report. And so that offers an interesting model in the way that Professor Spence was just suggesting.
Okay. Our next question comes from Max Touchette, a master's student at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. And it's specifically for Professor Spence, but I'd like the others to have a chance to talk about it also. It says, Professor Spence, could you maybe speak about the implications of the open Supreme Court seat on populations of Black folks across the country? If Trump fills the seat, what is your biggest worry or concern in this regard?
quickly that the Supreme Court will double down on kind of giving police the ability to enforce broad police powers. So as it stands right now, for example, the reasonable fear excuse that a number of police officers have used in the murder of folk in general, disproportionately black. I expect the Supreme Court would actually double down on that. I'd expect the Supreme Court to double down on voter suppression. I'd expect the Supreme Court to basically gut affirmative action laws and to have to narrow their conception of what discrimination looks like, and it's already narrow, but it reduced it even further.
Let me pair that with another question that we've gotten from Zulfi, which says, has any consideration been given to limiting the term or to putting age limits for Supreme Court justices? I know that this is an issue that's been in the news recently, but I wonder if the rest of the panel would like to respond to that.
Well, there's been some consideration on all of that. And of course, President Roosevelt in 1937 and 1938 wanted to pack the court to add one jurist for every jurist who was over 70, I think, or maybe 72, maybe 65, I don't know, but something like that. It was so unpopular that he was basically slaughtered in 1938 midterm elections. Democrats have that tool in their pocket; they may consider it.
Maybe the United States should follow the Canadian model. Age 75 is a limit that you can be on the court. So that would not be an unreasonable kind of compromise, perhaps.
On the court's possible actions going forward, I just will jump in also and add to the discussion that I think it's fairly clear there would be an assault on reproductive rights, reproductive freedom. I think that would hit women of color especially hard, and healthcare. Obamacare has done a lot to increase access to health insurance in the US. It's certainly not perfect, but I think that we could expect to see that significantly undermined in a court with more Trump appointees on it. And again, that would hit Black and brown and poor communities the hardest in the United States.
I think some of you mentioned this in your remarks earlier, but just to tease this out a bit more, there has been a sense, I think, amongst Republican voters that they will vote for a president based on his pledge or her pledge to appoint conservative justices. And I'm wondering, when you look at the schedule, what we presume is the schedule for the nomination of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's successor, I think the president has said they'll announce someone on Saturday. How much of a motivating factor is that going to be in getting Republicans to the polls? And conversely, how much of a motivating factor is that going to be for Democratic voters to get to the polls?
I'll just jump in on this one. I mean, I think that it's the entire scenario of what's happened with the unfortunate passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the timing of the situation, to me, is clearly a net positive for Trump. I mean, again, there are Republicans who are on the fence about supporting him. Can they really go vote for someone who behaves this way? Can they really go vote for someone who makes such offensive statements? And yet, their judicial appointments are very, very, very high priority for many Republican voters. And so I think that this is going to pull back some of those reluctant Republican voters, perhaps to vote for Trump, who might not otherwise have. And I think that regardless of the exact timing of how the process unfolds, it has completely shifted the conversation away from COVID, away from racial justice, away from the economic harm being brought upon the country, away from rising inequality. I mean, we haven't even talked about education yet here today. And, very large numbers of American kids have been forced into virtual learning. I mean, there are immediate pressing problems in the country, most of which do not benefit Trump in his quest for re-election. And yet suddenly, everyone is back to talking about sort of culture wars and the Supreme Court. So I think it is definitely a net benefit to Trump in the sense of shifting the conversation to a topic that's more favorable to him and that could potentially energize and turn out some elements of the Republican Party that would have been reluctant otherwise.
I just add one thing to that. I think that's on the mark here. I think there's so much opposition or support for Trump baked into the system that I'm not sure at this late juncture how much of a difference it makes with the party identifiers. I think where it might have some impact is with the independents. I mean, there's still that small marginal group of independents that may be, and we know they're not always really independents, they're leaners, Republicans or Democrats. And so that might be to the extent. But I would see this largely because the things have been so baked into the system already and the polarization has been so intense, at least sort of from where I sit, that it's not going to be particularly consequential.
Does anyone want to hazard a guess as to when Senator McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, will schedule a vote? Will it be before or after the election?
I'll jump in. I think it's going to be about 2 days before the election.
We'll hold you to that.
You're just saying that.
Maybe we should start.
He used the professor face on y'all where it looked like it's real authoritative, and then he gave it away because he started laughing.
All right, let's go on to the next question. This is from Jacques Van Beek. Could you fast forward 4 years if President Trump is reelected? What do you project for international relations, trust in institutions, and the level of civil unrest? A very specific question for all of you. Anyone's welcome to.
Okay, I mean, I might try this. The easy answer, the facile answer is that if you don't like this stuff, it'll be worse. If you like it, it'll be better, and all of those things. I think now there's nothing normal about the presidency of Donald Trump, nor of Donald Trump himself. But in a normal presidential swing, a normal presidential 8-year period, around year 5.5 into year 6.5, the president starts to worry about his or her legacy and begins to moderate a little bit, goes to China, goes to Russia, although he did that in year 4. They saw a little bit of that in Clinton until he got impeached. And presidents tend to want to smooth away the rough edges of their administration. Now, this is an administration of all rough edges, so there's a lot of smoothing to be done by someone who doesn't like to do smooth things. The president may want to try to smooth himself out, but I think he's going to conclude that the people who are going to write history are people who aren't going to like him, and that this is a waste of time for him. The professoriate, my 3 other colleagues, without identifying their own individual, are not likely to write glowing biographies of the president nor accounts of his 4 or 8 years, and so history is going to be written by historians and by some ink-stained wretches like me, but mostly by historians, and they're predisposed not to like him. So the kind of things that presidents ordinarily do in years 5, 6, and 7, and 8, you may not see from the president.
So I'll just point to that number again: 200,000 deaths in 6 months. 200,000 deaths in 6 months. I can name 10 people personally who passed away. All of them in the Detroit area. So I think that if he's in another 4 years, what we're going to see is that death toll is going to increase significantly. And the thing is we've got basically an economy that's really bolstered right now by a certain type of market confidence. If you look at the New York Stock Exchange, it's almost at the same level it was before COVID. At some moment in time, that's all going to give way because it's all fake. We're working on the assumption that things are going to get back to normal. If you've got another 4 years of someone who doesn't believe in science, of an entire tendency that rails against science, what you're going to have is basically a state that is nothing like the type of state that is required to deal with the complex needs of a nation like the United States. So you'll see civil unrest like we haven't seen in the modern moment. And then once you see that civil unrest coming from basically one of the two or three most important empires on the face of the planet, then that'll spread out.
Would anyone else like to offer a different view or a similar view? All right, let's go on. We have a series of questions about democratic values, which I'm going to try to group together, and particularly how U.S. democratic values affect the United States as a model for leadership in the rest of the world. Should President Trump be reelected, would this mean a decline of the United States as a motto of good values and its influence in the rest of the world? And then also, the U.S. and subsequently the liberal international order is far from what it was 4 or 14 years ago. If Biden manages to win, can we ever expect the U.S. or the liberal international order to get back to a functioning state, and how long would that take?
Well, I'll tackle the first part of that question. So, as was noted earlier, international public opinion toward the U.S. is at some of its lowest recorded levels ever. And there is perhaps some debate how much of that was caused by Trump, how much of that is caused by other factors. But I mean, a colleague and I were recently looking at a survey, a large international survey that was conducted when the presidential election happened in 2016. So some folks were surveyed right before the election, and this was in Latin America, and some were surveyed immediately after the election. And so we compared the people who were surveyed essentially when Clinton was expected to win with the people who were surveyed starting the day after, once it was known that Trump had won. And we saw a large decline in the trust that they expressed in the US government, just from one day to the next. It was a very sharp decline. And so, I mean, there's little bits of evidence like that out there that are starting to come out sort of from research and from polling and from data around the world, suggesting that, yes, in fact, the election of Trump has caused a real decrease in confidence toward the US. I mean, we've seen things we never would have expected, like, you know, international human rights organizations needing to turn more of their focus actually to the US in a critical way. You know, I've participated in election observing abroad for the OAS before. And, you know, I have to say that I almost wish that there were the same type of election observing happening in the US going forward for this election. So I think that we have seen a really serious decline in the quality and functioning of democracy in the US and in perceptions of that abroad, you know, and a real decline in American soft power. I mean, some of the things that I used to try to work on in the State Department, you know, international exchanges, bringing foreign students to the US. I mean, those have all been curtailed in multiple ways. So there's been a real hit on America's relationship with the world.
Anyone else like to try that one?
Oh, I just add one point to that. You know, the Economist does this kind of yearly survey in terms of assessing democracy. And you know that the United States over the several years now has really moved down in terms of its seeming commitment to democracy instead of being a full-fledged democracy. I think, you know, that is sort of indicative of what we have seen and, you know, what the problems have been. In terms of a liberal international order, you know, certainly candidate Biden and some of his writings, you know, wants to move back in that direction of a liberal international order. I'm not sure that it can all be rebuilt here. I mean, certainly, you know, and maybe our moderator here talks about relations with China and so on, you know, in terms of trying to put together what the Obama administration did with that, you know, that turn towards Asia. Can the Trump administration do that, or any successor administration? I think that, you know, that's obviously very important at this juncture with the rise of China. And, you know, I think it's actually more has been done than sort of meets the public eye, but nonetheless, that's a real challenge in terms of having the liberal order kind of coalesce. You know, and Pompeo, of course, has been now trying to woo the Europeans in terms of their position on China as well. So there has been an effort to try to move, despite sort of the protestations or proclamations, I guess, with the president about the international order back in that direction. But I'm not sure that Trump is in a position to do that. And I think it'll be a long slog even for the Biden administration.
Well, I'll answer that question after the election. I'm supposed to be giving a talk, I think a week after the election, on U.S.-China relations. So if anyone wants to come back in a few weeks, maybe I'll have an answer for you then. We'll see. Let's go on to the next question from Guillaume Dubois. Is a master's student at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, and it's directed to Mr. Shribman, but of course others are welcome to answer it as well. He said, you said this election was simply about fatigue. Are Americans tired of the Trump administration, or are they willing to continue for 4 more years? My question is, has the American system not itself entered into a phase of fatigue in which there is a loss of confidence in the institutions? If so, what does that mean for this election and for the U.S. as an appealing model in the Western world?
I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that the number of countries in the world that use the United States Constitution as a model for their own constitutions is several score. Whether anyone would do that again today is another question. I can't answer the question, but I can tell you this. For my final exam last year at McGill, it was an essay question, and it was a take-home test. And the question was very simple. Is the United States a democracy? Question mark. And I got some amazing answers, and they were very, 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 very provocative. But the most provocative was from a Canadian who argued that Canada was more democratic than the United States. She made a compelling argument. I won't share it with you, but generally speaking, I think this is the very fact you asked this question, the very fact that I asked the question in my final exam, the very fact that she answered with such eloquence and such passion the way she did means it's an active question, a vital question, and one in which we must answer sometime in the next decade.
Anyone else?
Anybody want to take that final exam?
It's an interesting question. Let's move on. There's a question from Sandy Morose, formerly with the Canadian government. She refers to a recent Barton Gellman article in The Atlantic called "The Election That Could Break America," which sets out how Trump and the Republican National Committee are undermining the integrity of the election, and asks who could stop them if they throw the election results into chaos by illegal and other challenges. Similar a bit to the question before on what happens in the event of a disputed election. But has anyone here seen the Atlantic piece? And would you like to comment on it? Go ahead.
Well, I think we've discussed this. I would only say that Barton Gellman is a very sober person, almost as boring as I am. He's not an alarmist. He's not a radical. And an article by Barton Gellman needs to be taken seriously from the very first syllable to the last.
That's a very strong endorsement. Anyone else?
The thing is we don't.
Go ahead.
We don't have models for this, right? We have external models. We can point to other nations in order to talk about, how we've assisted them in dealing with electoral conflicts. We could think about how other nations have internally dealt with this, but we're a different nation type, and the closest thing we've come to this was 2000. And even then we had 2 candidates who were willing to actually, they were willing to fight to a certain degree, but they were willing to kind of once everything was said and done, they're willing to kind of follow the rules. But in this case, we simply don't. And it seems to me we've got one political party that in a number of different ways acts more like a deep ideological tendency as opposed to a political party in a democracy. and then we've got another party that acts like a political party in a democracy. So, we've got no sense of what's going to happen.
And I'll just add in reference to 2000 that, one thing that's potentially more explosive and certainly more unpredictable today is the politicization of the Supreme Court. It's the fact that in 2000, the election ended up in the Supreme Court. And right now, there's a vacant seat. There is a war about to be unleashed over that seat. And in fact, the last nomination of Brett Kavanaugh was, I think, profoundly traumatic for some people in the country. So there's a degree of conflict over the Supreme Court today that really even makes the year 2000's path unrealistic, unfortunately.
And it's really deep, because if you were to look at American media, you won't see anybody connecting those two dots, right? So you see articles about, for example, Trump saying that he won't concede. You'll see articles saying that there's a significant conflict over the Supreme Court, but Trump has also stated clearly that he expects that justice to actually help rule in his favor. So we actually have him explicitly politicizing the court for his election, but the American media hasn't really talked about it. They've been focused. One of the things that frustrates me most about this election cycle is people have asked me to talk about the election in a number of different ways, but they're mostly focused on the horse race aspects rather than on the very real possibility, that rather than on the fact that we have a president in office who's said he is going to steal the election.
Perhaps on a related note, and this may be our final question, given we're running out of time. This is from Emma Oliver, who is a senior student journalist at the University of South Florida. And she says, if Biden wins the presidential election, do you think there is a possibility of violence amongst Trump supporters? For example, a non-peaceful transfer of power. We've discussed the transfer of power aspect, but to really talk about violence, from either Trump supporters or Biden supporters, to be fair. Would anyone like to comment on that?
I'll just say quickly that it's not a hypothetical question. So unfortunately, we're already seeing a level of political conflict, including political violence in the United States, that hasn't been seen for a long time. Unfortunately, the federal government's efforts to track particularly right-wing extremist groups, militias, white supremacist groups, those efforts have been undermined throughout the Trump administration. But based on what we do know, the data is very alarming. It is very, very alarming. And we have to be very clear that, of course, there are individuals on the left who do sometimes commit acts of violence, but the preponderance of the threat is unfortunately coming from these right-wing extremist groups who are mobilizing and who are armed already. And so I don't think it's a hypothetical question. I think that there will probably be more violence related to the election leading up to it. And unfortunately, I don't see any reason to think that it would subside if Trump loses and if Biden is elected, particularly because, my view is that if Trump loses, I do believe that he'll leave office, but I think that he'll continue to be very active in media circles and on social media and continue fanning the flames of conflict, much in the way he's done as president.
Would anyone else like to offer a differing view, perhaps a more optimistic view?
I'd add a subtler view.
Go ahead.
Thinking about that Red Nation image I started with, I think that you'd see an increased number of attempts to destabilize local governments. Mr. Shribman talked about the Hayes-Tilton Compromise. After, at the end of Reconstruction, you saw a number of attempts of whites to basically eradicate Black governments throughout the South. You wouldn't see something like that necessarily, but in places where white supremacists are already concentrated in Washington, in Idaho, for example, I think you'd see significant violence, and then less so in major cities, just because the concentration of people of color is probably too high.
Anyone else? All right. Well, we'll have to leave it at that. not exactly an uplifting finish to our discussion, but we are very grateful for our Regina Bateson, James McCormick, David Shribman, and Lester Spence for joining us this afternoon. We'd also like to thank Rita Abramson, the SIPS director, Anna Bojic, the SIPS Research Center coordinator, and Andrew and Pierre from our University of Ottawa Site, Multimedia, and Events Office for their help making possible this afternoon's event. And of course, we'd like to thank everyone in the audience for your questions. Before closing, we'd also like to invite you to save the date for 3 upcoming SIPS events. On September 30th, we will be hosting an international Twitter conference on understanding the Five Eyes intelligence network. On October 5th, we have an event on the war in Yemen. And on October 28th, we are co-hosting with the Alex Trebek Initiative at the University of Ottawa, the Ottawa premiere of the film, What is Democracy?, followed by a panel discussion. More information is available on SIP's website. That's www.sips-cepi.ca and on social media. Thank you again to all of our panelists and everyone in the audience, and good night from the University of Ottawa.